The smoke invaded her lungs before she even realized the danger. Lillian James jolted awake, her eyes burning as the thick gray cloud enveloped her bedroom. The crackling sound had infiltrated her dreams, but now the terrifying reality set in her house was on fire. Wyoming Territory, 1876. Lillian had only been living in Cottonwood Springs for 4 months, having traveled from Boston after inheriting her uncle's modest homestead on the outskirts of town. The small wooden house had been her fresh start after years of serving as a governess for wealthy families. At 26, she had finally found a place to call her own. Now, as flames licked up the walls of her bedroom, that dream was quite literally going up in smoke. Lillian tried to stand, but fell back onto the bed as a coughing fit racked her body. The heat intensified by the second, and the roar of the fire drowned out all other sounds. The window across the room seemed miles away, and the bedroom door was already engulfed in flames, blocking her escape to the front of the house. Through the thick smoke, she could barely make out the familiar shapes of her furniture. Disoriented and dizzy from lack of air, she slid from the bed onto her hands and knees, remembering somewhere in the back of her mind that staying low might help her breathe. The floorboards were hot beneath her palms as she crawled forward, her white cotton nightgown dragging beneath her. Outside the house, Kade Garrett was returning from a late night at the Silver Spur Saloon. He wasn't drunk, he never allowed himself to get too deep in his cups, but he'd stayed later than usual playing cards with some of the other ranch hands. At 30 years old, Kade had spent more than half his life on horseback, working ranches across the territory. For the past 2 years, he'd been the foreman at the White Pine Ranch just outside of Cottonwood Springs. Riding past the James place on his way back to the ranch, Kade noticed an unusual orange glow behind the curtains. Pulling his horse to a stop, he watched with growing alarm as smoke began to seep from under the eaves of the small homestead. Without hesitation, he kicked his horse into a gallop toward the property. By the time he reached the house, flames were visible through the windows. Kade leapt from his horse, tethering him quickly to a fence post at a safe distance from the blaze. He ran toward the front door, calling out as he approached, "Hello? Anybody inside? Your house is on fire." There was no answer, but Kade was almost certain Miss James was home. He'd seen her in town earlier that day, purchasing supplies at the general store. Everyone in the small community knew the Eastern lady who'd moved into old Joe James's place. She kept to herself mostly, but was unfailingly polite when their paths crossed. Kade had tipped his hat to her more than once, admiring her quiet dignity, but never finding the nerve to strike up a proper conversation. Kade tried the front door, but the handle was too hot to touch, and flames were visible through the nearby window. Circling the house quickly, he tried to determine where Miss James might be sleeping. At the back of the house, he spotted a window with curtains drawn but no flames yet visible. Without hesitation, he pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth, shrugged out of his heavy canvas coat, wrapped it around his right arm, and used his elbow to smash through the glass. Inside the bedroom, Lillian's eyes shot toward the sound of breaking glass. Through the thickening smoke, she could make out a silhouette at the window, clearing away the jagged edges of glass. "Miss James, are you in there?" A deep voice called through the opening. "Here," Lillian managed between coughs. "I am here. Stay low and come toward my voice," the man instructed. With renewed determination, Lillian continued crawling toward the window, the air growing thinner with each passing second. Just as she reached the wall beneath the window, a section of the ceiling behind her collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending sparks and embers raining down onto her bed. Large, strong hands reached through the window, grasping blindly. "Give me your hands, Miss James." Lillian raised her arms up toward the voice, and immediately felt her wrists gripped firmly. With surprising strength, the man began to pull her up and out through the window. Her nightgown caught on a piece of broken glass, tearing as she was hauled through the narrow opening, but she barely noticed. All she could focus on was the blessed cool night air that greeted her as she emerged from the inferno. Kade pulled the coughing woman through the window and immediately scooped her up into his arms, carrying her away from the burning structure. He noticed she was barefoot, her nightgown singed in places, her dark hair wild around her soot-streaked face. Her eyes were red and watery from the smoke, but they were open, and she was breathing. You are safe now, Miss James, he said, setting her down gently on the grass at a safe distance from the house. Are you hurt? Lillian shook her head, still coughing too violently to speak. She looked back at her house, now fully engulfed in flames, and felt a crushing sense of loss. Everything she owned in the world was inside that house. We need to alert the town, Kade said, shrugging out of his shirt and draping it over her shoulders to cover her thin nightgown. Can you stand? Lillian nodded, accepting his help to rise to her feet. The moment she put weight on her soles, however, she winced in pain. Looking down, she realized her feet were cut and bleeding, likely from glass or debris on the ground. Without hesitation, Kade lifted her again, carrying her to where his horse waited. I will take you into town. We need to get help for the fire and have the doctor look at those cuts. Lillian found her voice at last. Thank you, Mr. Garrett. Kade Garrett. I work over at White Pine Ranch. Thank you, Mr. Garrett. You saved my life. Their eyes met for a long moment, and something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of the gravity of what had just transpired. Then Kade broke the gaze, gently placing Lillian on his horse before mounting behind her. Hold tight to the saddle horn, Miss James. We will get you help. As they rode toward town, Lillian leaned back against Kade's solid chest, her body trembling from shock and the cool night air. The warmth of him behind her was comforting as she watched her home and everything she owned burn in the distance. Doc Wilson's house sat at the edge of Cottonwood Springs, its windows dark at this late hour. Kade pounded on the door until a light appeared inside, and the doctor, a man in his 60s with a shock of white hair, appeared in his nightclothes. What in tarnation, the old doctor began, then saw Lillian's condition. Bring her in, bring her in. Kade carried Lillian inside, placing her carefully on the examination table in the doctor's front room. Miss James's house caught fire. I pulled her out through a window. Her feet are cut up pretty bad. I need to alert the town about the fire, Kade continued. Will you be all right here, Miss James? Lillian nodded, suddenly reluctant to see him go. Yes. Thank you again, Mr. Garrett. I will be back to check on you, he promised, then disappeared into the night. By dawn, Lillian's house was nothing but smoldering ruins. The townsfolk had formed a bucket brigade, but their efforts had focused primarily on preventing the fire from spreading to the surrounding grassland, which was dangerously dry after weeks without rain. There had been no saving the house itself. Kade found Lillian sitting on the doctor's porch, her bandaged feet propped on a stool, wearing a borrowed dress from the doctor's wife that hung loosely on her slender frame. Miss James, he said, removing his hat as he approached. How are you feeling this morning? As well as can be expected, I suppose, she replied, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. The doctor says my feet should heal in a week or so. Nothing too serious. Kade nodded, sitting on the step beside her stool. I went by your place. I am sorry, but there is nothing left. Lillian closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this confirmation of what she already knew. I suspected as much. At least I am alive to worry about what comes next. She looked at him directly. Thanks to you. Kade shrugged uncomfortably. Anyone would have done the same. But it was not anyone. It was you. Lillian's eyes filled with tears. I do not know what I am going to do now. I have no home, no possessions, not even shoes. A humorless laugh escaped her. All I have left in this world is a borrowed dress and the nightgown on my back, and even that is torn beyond repair. Kade hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small item. Not quite all, he said, holding out his hand to reveal a silver locket. I went back after the embers cooled. Found this in what was left of your bedroom. Chain was melted, but the locket survived. Lillian gasped, reaching for the small silver oval with trembling fingers. My mother's locket. I thought it was lost forever. She opened it carefully, revealing the tiny portrait inside a woman with Lillian's same dark eyes. Thank you. This means more than you can know. The moment was interrupted by Doc Wilson's appearance at the door. Miss James, Mrs. Abernathy from the boarding house is here. Says she has a room available for you, at least temporarily. Lillian nodded gratefully, tucking the locket into the pocket of her borrowed dress. That is very kind of her. I will help you get settled, Kade offered, standing and extending his hand to help her up. Over the next few days, the community of Cottonwood Springs rallied around Lillian. The women brought clothing, the men offered to clear the burned remains of her house, and the shopkeepers provided store credit so she could obtain necessities. Yet despite this kindness, Lillian felt adrift. Her inheritance had been modest, most of it tied up in the house itself and the furnishings she had shipped from Boston. Her savings would not last long at the boarding house, and the prospect of rebuilding seemed overwhelming. Kade visited her daily, first bringing her a pair of soft leather moccasins he'd purchased from a Shoshone woman who occasionally sold goods in town. "Until your feet heal properly," he explained gruffly, embarrassed by her gratitude. On his third visit, he found her sitting in the boarding house parlor, staring out the window at the street. "Miss James," he greeted, hat in hand. "You are looking better today." "Mr. Garrett," she smiled, genuine pleasure lighting her face at his arrival. "Please sit down." Kade sat opposite her, his large frame making the dainty parlor chair appear comically small. "I wanted to tell you that some of the boys from the ranch and I cleared away the worst of the debris from your property yesterday. There is still work to be done, but at least the dangerous parts are gone." "That is so kind of you," Lillian said. "I wish I could repay everyone's kindness somehow." "No need for that. It is just what neighbors do out here." Kade cleared his throat. "Miss James, I have been thinking about your situation. My boss, Mr. Crawford, mentioned that his wife has been looking for someone to help tutor their children. They live at the main house at White Pine. It would be a paying position, with room and board included." Lillian's eyes widened. "Teaching again?" "I was a governess for many years in Boston." "So Mr. Crawford heard. News travels fast in a small town," Kade smiled. "Their children are 10 and 8. Smart youngsters, but they need more education than Mrs. Crawford can provide herself." "I would be most interested," Lillian said eagerly. "When might I speak with Mrs. Crawford about this opportunity?" "She asked if you might come out to the ranch tomorrow for lunch, if you were feeling up to it. I could escort you." "Yes, I would like that very much." The next day, Kade arrived at the boarding house driving a small buggy rather than riding his usual horse. He helped Lillian up onto the seat, careful of her still healing feet, and they set off for the White Pine Ranch. As they drove, Lillian took in the vast landscape around them. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow even in early summer. The prairie stretched out in waves of green and gold, dotted with wildflowers. The beauty of it all made her catch her breath. "It is quite something, is it not?" Kade said, noticing her reaction. "I have been all over this territory, and I still find myself stopping just to look sometimes." "It is magnificent," Lillian agreed. "So different from Boston. Even after 4 months here, I am still adjusting to the scale of everything: the sky, the mountains, the distances between places." "What brought you out here in the first place?" Kade asked, "if you do not mind my asking. It is quite a change from city life." Lillian was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "My uncle Joseph James left me his property when he passed. I had never met him. He and my father had a falling out before I was born, but he had no other family. When the lawyer's letter arrived, I was at a crossroads in my life. The family I had been working for was relocating to Europe, and I was faced with finding a new position." She gazed out at the landscape as she continued. "I had spent my entire life in other people's homes, following their rules, raising their children. The idea of having a home of my own, even one in a place I had never seen, was irresistible. And now," Kade asked gently, "now I am back where I started. Homeless, looking for a position in someone else's house." She gave a small, rueful smile. "But at least I am alive to do so." "Your land is still yours," Kade pointed out. "The house is gone, but the property remains." Lillian nodded. "Yes, though I cannot imagine how I would ever rebuild. But enough about my troubles. Tell me about yourself, Mr. Garrett. Have you always been a rancher?" As they continued their journey, Kade told her about growing up in Texas, learning to work cattle from his father, and making his way north after the war, finding work on ranches throughout the territories. He spoke of the satisfaction he found in honest work, the camaraderie among the ranch hands, and his hopes of someday having a spread of his own. "You speak of ranching with such passion," Lillian observed. "It clearly means a great deal to you." "It is all I know," Kade replied simply. "All I have ever wanted to do." When they reached White Pine Ranch, Lillian was impressed by the size and prosperity of the operation. The main house was a substantial 2-story structure built of sturdy logs, with a wide porch wrapped around two sides. Outbuildings, corrals, and bunkhouses spread out behind it, and in the distance, cattle grazed on lush pasture land. Mrs. Crawford, a pleasant woman in her 30s, welcomed Lillian warmly. "Miss James, we were so sorry to hear about the fire. What a terrible ordeal for you. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Crawford. And thank you for considering me for the position with your children." Over lunch, Lillian met the Crawford children, Richard and Emma, bright and curious youngsters who clearly could benefit from formal education. By the end of the meal, Mrs. Crawford had offered Lillian the position to begin the following week once her feet had fully healed. "You will have the small cottage behind the main house," Mrs. Crawford explained. "It is just 2 rooms, but it has its own stove and is quite cozy. The children will come to you for lessons each morning, and you will have your afternoons to yourself." "It sounds perfect," Lillian said sincerely. "I cannot thank you enough for this opportunity." As Kade drove Lillian back to town later that afternoon, she felt more hopeful than she had since the fire. "It will be strange to return to teaching after my brief taste of independence," she mused. "But I am grateful for the position." "The Crawfords are good people," Kade assured her. "You will be treated well there." "And I will see you occasionally?" Lillian asked, then blushed at her own boldness. "Since you work at White Pine as well?" Kade's smile reached his eyes. "Yes, Miss James. I expect we will see each other quite often." Over the next several months, Lillian settled into life at White Pine Ranch. The children proved to be eager students, and Mrs. Crawford was a fair and generous employer. The little cottage became a home, decorated simply with the few items Lillian had been able to purchase with her first wages. True to his word, Kade was a frequent visitor. At first, his visits had practical purposes, delivering firewood, fixing a loose floorboard, bringing a book he thought the children might enjoy for their lessons. But as summer turned to fall, the pretexts grew thinner, and both Lillian and Kade knew that he was calling on her because he wished to see her. Their friendship deepened through shared meals, long conversations on her small porch, and occasional rides around the vast property. Lillian found herself looking forward to these moments more than anything else in her new life. One crisp October evening, Kade arrived at her cottage with a basket in hand. "Mrs. Crawford sent some apple pie," he explained. "Fresh baked this afternoon." "How thoughtful," Lillian smiled, inviting him in. She had just stoked the fire in her small stove, and the cottage was warm and inviting. "Will you stay and have some with me?" They sat at her small table, enjoying the pie and each other's company. As the evening progressed, their conversation turned to more personal matters. "Do you ever think about going back east?" Kade asked suddenly. Lillian considered the question. "Sometimes. Not because I wish to return, but because I wonder how differently my life might have turned out if I had stayed. If the fire had not happened, I might still be in my uncle's house, living alone, gradually becoming the town spinster. And now I feel as though I belong here, despite everything." She met his gaze steadily. "The fire was devastating, but it also led me here. To this place. To the Crawfords. To knowing you." Kade reached across the table and took her hand. "Lillian," he said, using her given name for the first time. "I need to tell you something. I have been saving money for years. I just purchased a piece of land not far from here. Good grazing land with a creek running through it. I plan to start building in the spring. Your own ranch." Lillian squeezed his hand. "That is wonderful news, Kade. Your dream is coming true." "Part of it," he acknowledged. "But lately, my dream has expanded to include something else. Someone else." Lillian's heart began to race as she realized what he was saying. "I know it has not been a year since we met," Kade continued, "and our meeting was hardly conventional. But I cannot imagine my life without you in it now." He took a deep breath. "I am not a man of fancy words, Lillian, but I love you. And I would be honored if you would consider becoming my wife." Tears filled Lillian's eyes. "I love you too, Kade. I think I have since the night you pulled me from that fire." "Is that a yes?" he asked, his smile widening. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Their wedding took place on Christmas Eve in the small church in Cottonwood Springs. The entire town turned out, along with the Crawford family and all the hands from White Pine Ranch. Lillian wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Crawford had helped her make, with her mother's locket now with a new silver chain around her neck. After the ceremony, Kade surprised Lillian by taking her to see the progress on their new home. Though only the foundation and frame were completed, she could already envision the life they would build there together. It will be ready by spring, Kade promised, his arm around her waist as they stood looking at their future home. Mr. Crawford has given me leave to work on it whenever I am not needed at White Pine, and some of the other men have offered to help. It is perfect, Lillian said, leaning into him. I cannot wait to make it our home. There is one more thing, Kade said, reaching into his pocket. A wedding gift. He handed her a small box. Inside was a deed to her uncle's property in Cottonwood Springs. I do not understand, Lillian said, confused. This is my land already. Look at the date, Kade said gently. The deed was dated just 1 week earlier. After the fire, the bank was going to claim the property for unpaid taxes, Kade explained. I purchased it to keep it in your name. I thought perhaps someday we might build there again a second home, closer to town for when we need to visit. Or perhaps for one of our children someday. Tears filled Lillian's eyes once more. Our children, she repeated softly. On my land. Our land. From ashes to new beginnings, Kade said, pulling her close. That seems to be our pattern. As winter gave way to spring, Kade and Lillian moved into their new ranch house. It was modest but solid, built with care and an eye toward future expansion. Lillian planted a garden while Kade tended to his small but growing herd of cattle. Each evening, they sat together on their porch, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in brilliant colors. I never would have thought, Lillian mused one such evening, her head resting on Kade's shoulder, that losing everything in that fire would lead to gaining everything I truly needed. I thank God every day that I happened to ride past your place that night, Kade said, kissing the top of her head. It was not chance, Lillian said with certainty. It was fate. A year to the day after the fire, they returned to the site of Lillian's former home in Cottonwood Springs. The charred remains had long since been cleared away, leaving only the stone foundation as evidence of what had once stood there. Are you sure you want to do this? Kade asked as they stood looking at the empty plot. Lillian nodded. It feels right. A way of honoring the past while embracing our future. Together, they planted a young apple tree in the center of where the house had once stood. One day, Lillian said, patting the soil around the sapling, we will bring our children here to pick apples. And we will tell them the story of how their father saved their mother from a fire, and how sometimes the things that seem like endings are really just beginnings in disguise. Kade wrapped his arms around his wife, his hands resting gently on the small swell of her belly where their first child was growing. I love you, Lillian Garrett. And I love you, Kade Garrett. My hero, my husband, my heart. As they rode back to their ranch that evening, Lillian looked back just once at the small tree standing alone on her former property. In her mind's eye, she could see it years from now strong and tall, bearing fruit, surrounded by the laughter of children. Just as the fire had forged her life into something unexpected and beautiful, that sapling would grow from humble beginnings into something enduring and life-giving. From smoke and flame had come a love that would last a lifetime and beyond, into generations to come. Lillian turned her face forward, toward home, toward Kade, toward their future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger for having already walked through fire and emerged, hand in hand, on the other side.